This is Weird Science 16, 1952. It was the publisher's favorite cover, Russ Cochran. He's had the original artwork up until recently for years. One of my favorite covers. Absolutely my favorite Weird Science cover because of the Bradbury logo and the combination of the fact that this is the perfect synthesis between EC's horror comics and their science fiction comics. When I was a kid in the Midwest, my father owned a grocery store, and before I published the first fanzine that I had done about EC, and we were discovering EC comics, we weren't buying them off the newsstands. We were the second generation fans, and if any of us at the time would have thought that the publisher had actually saved 12 copies in perfect condition, we would have been amazed. By 1967, when we were in high school and when we had published the first copy of our fanzine and we had gone to New York City to meet Bill Gaines, we were ushered into his closet and he showed us a huge stack of cardboard boxes, inside of which were these copies. They have been broken out now and put into bound boxes, and they're here at Sotheby's at the third comic book and comic art auction. And they're going to be known as the Gaines file copies. People who have spent their lifetime with these comic books and have seen every variant of every grade of condition are pretty much breathless when they see these books. They're just about as perfect as you can get. The interior paper is white. Luckily, before we lost Bill Gaines, he went ahead and signed thousands of certificates. This must have driven him crazy. And Russ had Sergio Aragones do a beautiful little drawing. So each comic book comes with a certificate. Part of the excitement to this next Sotheby's auction is going to be the fact that these EC file copies are here. They're going up in complete sets, and most of the sets are boxed in these beautiful handmade boxes. Condition is everything to rarity in comics. It's the difference between something being worth $20,000 or $150,000 with a book as important as Action 1, and its condition, which continues to dominate the market. A big part of what's really important at this auction and what people are going after are the elusive, rare comics that are in top condition. Even though this year's auction is 63% now based in artwork, comic books still are the engine which define what our market is about. Let's take a break now.
Okay.
As we talk about the great engine, I suppose, of the auction, last year the big news was Sotheby's had an unrestored copy of the comic book to my left here, Action Comics #1. The paper was browning somewhat at the edges, but it was completely unrestored, and it sold for $82,500, which was a world record at auction with a buyer's premium. Again, condition and rarity. You can kind of get an idea, or the viewer who's maybe not seen these two particular comics before might be given a clue as to why, after nearly a decade, DC Comics on our left here with Superman was able to sue Fawcett Comics on my right with Captain Marvel and prove the intent of a copy. Right down to the cover, Captain Marvel here is hurling a car. There is quite a bit of similarity. DC eventually won the lawsuit, and this character, Captain Marvel, which outsold Superman in the late 40s and the 50s, was eventually suppressed. These two copies, Action #1 and Whiz #2 or #1, are the origin issues of each character. And I guess to explain a little bit more about rarity in relation to unrestored books, this Whiz is very fairly priced, and it's separated here at the covers slightly, but it's probably going to be very briskly bid on at the auction, because this is an unrestored copy, and it's from a staff member at Fawcett Comics. So it has a little bit of provenance and history to it. The colors are very, very bright, and the truth is there are fewer and fewer copies that are untouched. The Action one is a near perfect copy in many ways, but it turns out it's been washed. The cover's been washed, and there's been a little bit of work along the spine. So as exciting as this book would have been if it were untouched, it now has a little bit less of a glow in terms of rarity. The interior paper on this particular copy is gorgeous. It's very white. Action number 1 is the first appearance of Superman, and Detective 27 is the first appearance of Batman. Again, here is a copy which would be worth an enormous amount if it were in this condition, unrestored. And once again, though, it's a restored copy, so our range is $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, considerably less if this copy were actually very fine as it appears under the Mylar and in front of the camera. We're very fortunate this year to have 2 comic books in the auction. And as exciting as it might be to see them go up on the block and see them hammered for a lot of money, the truth is really that discovering these 2 comic books and knowing that they exist is much more exciting for the collectors community. Motion Pictures Funnies Weekly #1 on my left, and Marvel Comics #1 are the beginnings of Marvel Comics, timely publications. And there's been a debate running which still is unanswered as to which comic book appeared first. Inside this comic book here is a black and white interior with the appearance of the first story that appears also in this comic book on my right. And that story has the Submariner in it. These 2 copies are being called the payout copies. And you can see possibly the writing here. This actually says pay copy, and the cover of the Marvel Comics is written on. What's happened is we, through luck and time, have had the fortune to discover the bookkeeper's copy of Marvel Comics. And written inside on the interior pages are the check numbers and the dates for what they paid each artist. So Frank R. Paul, who was at this point a famous pulp illustrator in 1939, he had already debuted the major covers for Hugo Gernsback's Amazing Stories, the first science fiction magazines in America. Frank R. Paul was very popular. Frank R. Paul was paid $25 to do the cover of Marvel Comics #1. And inside there's information on what Bill Everett was paid for his work on Submariner, and so on and so forth. So there's a great deal of historical importance attached to these 2 comic books. Again, condition and rarity and the historical context are all rolled into one, but condition would be paramount to the worth of these 2 comics. When the Lloyd Jacquet estate was discovered, Motion Pictures Funnies Weekly was not known to exist before that point, and there were 7 copies, I believe, discovered in the estate. They all had tremendously dark brown paper. The extraordinary thing about this copy is that the OWL paper content is probably around a 7.5 or an 8. It's real high. The interior paper has become critical to comic books because as we've moved through time, I think people have become more aware that the appearance of something is one thing, but how far is it going to last into the next 2 generations? If at this point you will find more enthusiasts who would rather have a VG copy of Superman #1 with white paper than a very fine copy with brown paper. So once again, this Motion Pictures Funnies is so extraordinary because we finally found a copy with great interior paper.